In last video I reviewed other brand websites to get inspiration from, and near the end of that video I identified the components for my MVP. If you missed that, I'll leave a link down below. In this video I'll focus on the newsletter subscription component as an end-to-end solution, which I'll from now on call a module. I'll briefly go over the minimum requirements and I'll then show you how I created this vertically sliced module. I'll talk more about the technical decisions I made for this setup to keep it relatively easy to implement this module into your own projects, followed by a brief introduction to minimal APIs and vertical versus horizontal slicing. Afterwards, I'll demonstrate how to implement this module into your Blazor Server project, and after that into an end-to-end solution with HTTP communication to an API. Lastly, I'll talk about some more useful NuGet packages to leverage, such as MediatR, Mapster, Swagger. So this is the scheme I ended the last video with, where I identified the major components of our MVP. Starting with the newsletter subscription component. So the idea would be that I create this as an end-to-end solution, as a module, that you can then relatively easily implement into your own project. So for simplicity's sake, I just call this Frontend and backend. And let's now identify the minimum required functionality for a newsletter subscription. So for the front end, we'll likely want a newsletter subscription form, like you can see here, to just capture that email address and have that store in your database. So this newsletter module will need a database context that will contain the specifications for its entity, so we can then easily do a migration and have that table added to our database. We'll probably want some validation happening as well. So that would live in a shared project, which both the front-end project and the back-end project can reference and use. So I have built this module to both work with the Blazor Server project, where the front-end component directly accesses the back-end functionality to store it in the database. But I also support the front-end decoupled from the back-end, where the communication happens over HTTP. To transfer data from our front-end code to our back-end code and vice versa, we'll likely want to utilize DTOs, data transfer objects, which are basically just some classes representing the data you're sending, on which we can apply validators like I showed you in the Fluent validation video I posted recently. So let's now head over to the codebase. So in the codebase, so the API, database and features are basically the backend. The SharedSpa is the front end, and the underscores shared is the top level project holding the contracts and some reusable classes or variables for both the front end and the back end. Let's start with the front end, so the SharedSpa, that has a folder, create newsletter subscriber. So that is a declarative name of what this will contain, which functionality this will contain. We see a form, so a Blazor component containing a form that can capture that email address. So we have a form, a Blazor form with a model, subscription model, with a request. So that's that data transfer object. And on submit, it will handle, on valid submit, it will handle the subscription form. So it will just have a field to enter the email address, And then on handle subscription form, we can access subscription model.email to get the value of that actual address. That is the create newsletter subscription method that I just showed in the scheme. I let that invoke an event callback to pass this email back to the parent page or component that will use this subscription form. So that would be useful in the case of a Blazor Server project. Then you can pass that email to the code that handles the database storage. And the front-end backend split over HTTP, we'll likely want to do an HTTP call to communicate that data to the backend, to the API. Okay, let's now take a look at the backend project, which will start with the features project, which will hold this create newsletter subscribe logic, the business logic. I call this create newsletter subscriber command. This will inject what it needs and then check for if the subscriber already exists. If so, don't do anything else. Save it to the database. Add that subscription. So you see the same pattern again. The feature folders are also grouped by functionality, by task, and with a very declarative name. So we get one feature, create newsletter subscriber, and then another feature, get newsletter subscribers. And then we have the extension method, which is again that configure services that I usually call it, which will just have a static method that some kind of extension method that allows me to register this command that I just showed you and the query. This is a standalone module, so it contains everything it needs, but it's not a runnable project. This database project, which will require for you to do a migration to add that table to your and configuration to your actual database. So again, it will have the extension, so basically the starting point, the entry point to add that DB context to your actual project, which will, just add the DB context and make it and register that to our dependency container. So each module will have its own DB context. It's perfectly possible to have multiple contexts into the same database. So these will just translate to a table. So let's take a look at the database context, which will just inherit from Entity Framework Core DB context. So this holds the DB set, passes the options to the DB context, and configures an index and is unique on the entity of newsletter subscriber, which we'll now take a look at, which is just an email field, is subscribed boolean, is email confirmed boolean. And then this I still have to find a more elegant solution for. This auditable entity contains some metadata, which is useful on most of the entities. So an ID as the primary key and then some metadata fields. And as I see it now, it looks like I'm going to have to duplicate this in every module. If you know a better way to do this, please let me know. I might find it out later on the progress of the project, but I'm not going to focus on it right now. So that is all for the DB context. To add the newsletter subscriber table to your database, I added a README file, of course, to do the migrations. And an extra thing that has to happen is to define the context. Which context do you want to target? So that's all you need to implement that into your Blazor server project. Let's make one, and I'll show you how to add everything. And then after that, we'll take a look at the setup with the HTTP communication, which will then also use this API project. But for now, let's leave that out. So I already made this project. So this is your actual runnable project. I called it brand, so you wouldn't be stuck with my brand name. But this one will then implement all of these modules, and I'll show you how to do that. I created an API project mainly to just test out the entire module. Now we'll just use a Blazor server project. Let's create one. But that was so new project, and I'll call this project brand.prerender server because later on in the video series I'll repurpose this project for Blazor WebAssembly pre-rendering. But let's now use it as a Blazor server project. I'm quickly going to cut out what I don't need. And running that will just give us hello world. I'm going to replace that with the newsletter subscription form. So let's reference the project of the SharedSpa. And I'll add an import statement to the Blazor server project to access that create newsletter subscriber form to the index file. And that should give you the email address with a button join. I did wrap it in some basic bootstrap container, row and column with some margin top just to have a better visual. And I will of course let you choose the label of the button and maybe remove this one so you have more control over that, with the idea that you have just a basic as possible component that will just do what is required, and then you can completely wrap it with your own styling however you like. So now we're going to pass that email address to our database. So I use this event callback on submit and then pass the parameter, the arguments to the create newsletter subscriber method, which I created below, has a parameter of object arguments, which I will then cast to the request object. This should basically be, I changed this to subscription model in the case there were multiple fields. If you really only want to email, you could do this, but that should work. Let's give that a go. So I input the email, pressed join, and then in the console underneath, since it's a Blazor server project, I see test@gmail.com. So now we can pass that on to the method that will add that to the database. For that, we'll have to implement the features project into our pre-render configuration and our Blazor server project, I mean. So we'll have to use this extension method in our program CS of the Blazor. Let's see, builder.configuration. Then we'll likely have to reference that project, and that should work. And we should now be able to inject that create newsletter subscriber command if we have the correct imports, of course, like that. And then we could say command dot handle request. Yeah, that's an async. I should make that more clear. Oh yeah, and we also need to add that newsletter subscribers DB context to our Blazor server program. So that would be similar as with the features. We do call this extension method add newsletter subscribers db context and pass down the configuration. Let's rerun that. And one thing I forgot was to add the connection string. Let's add that. Should be good to go. And I'm going to add test1 because I already have test@gmail.com in the database, and the validation is not on point to catch that, so we might crash. Everything seemed to have inserted correctly. And then I quickly added some code to also get the newsletter subscribers, so to loop over them and show the email address by having a local property subscribers on initialize async. When the component renders initializes, we get the newsletter subscribers by getting that query.handle, and yeah, from this query handler. And then we see the form and all the email addresses stored in our database. So that works for a Blazor project. Let me know in the comment section below what you think about this implementation. Was this simple enough, or should I improve it somewhere, make it easier? So it's basically going to the program CS, adding the DB context of that module, the features of that module, referencing the front-end project, so the SharedSpa, and of course you need to make sure that you did all the migrations. That's basically it. For an API project that would work similarly, adding that subscribers, DB context and features. And in a front-end project, I just created a Blazor WebAssembly project. It would work similarly, only that it has to then send the data over the HTTP client. So let's add a reference to that front-end project, SharedSpa. We of course cannot use these features since that's a backend. Yeah, that's backend code, and we're in a client, a front-end project. But instead of using this command, this backend command, we'll be using the HTTP client to send that request over. You could either do that in your new Blazor project, Blazor WebAssembly project, or you could just have the SharedSpa let that handle for you. So what would that look like? Instead of doing the event callback, we'd probably do an HTTP call. So maybe we could add a parameter here that says send over HTTP or something, and then when that is true, we'll send it over HTTP, else we'll invoke it. And then on the Blazor project, you would just not access this event callback. So you could just let that happen. And then of course add this parameter, send over HTTP, just equals true, or lowercase, I don't know. Of course, I'll finish up these components, make it, allow you to choose, and I'll make that code available. So the reason I didn't complete the HTTP communication yet is because I would have to make I like to put those HTTP calls in a dedicated class. So I'd make a class file, call it newsletter subscribers HTTP client or something. But I also like to use those as some kind of global state providers. So let's say I fetch all the newsletter subscribers, and then the component reloads. I don't want to refetch those subscribers. I want to have those subscribers stored in a global property that I can then simply access on the component, so I don't do extra calls. So in short, what is vertical slicing? It's a project setup approach where you would group your functionality by what the purpose of the functionality is. So group your classes by what they're supposed to be doing, or even group your functionality by feature. So for example, you could have to-do items, which is the feature, and which would then be grouped by task. That would be vertically sliced. This might as well be a to-do items folder containing the to-do items controller, the interface, and all kinds of classes related to the to-do items logic functionality. And horizontal slicing would be to group your classes by type and then by feature. So for example, all these services, let's say weather forecast service, to-do item service, they would all live in this services folder, and the same for the controllers, and so on. So let's say everything related to the to-do items would be separated out in different folders. For example, to-do items controller in the controllers folder, to-do items service in the services folder, and so on, to-do items interface in the interfaces folder. So by class type rather than by the feature. You'd probably want to find a middle ground. In some cases, it might make more sense to go for the horizontal approach, and in other cases for the vertical approach. With business logic, so the features folders, you'll more likely see the vertical approach. An advantage of the vertical approach is it's more declarative. Everything is grouped together. You don't have to go search in 5 or 10 different folders to see what the entire feature does. And it might be easy to, let's say you start a new project and you want to copy that feature over to your new project, then there's less files and less places to copy the files from. I hope that was somewhat clear, the difference between a vertically sliced project setup and a horizontally sliced setup. And then of course we need to do HTTP communication to an API, so to an API endpoint. So that's where this API project comes in. This API project is set up with the minimal API configuration, which are configured on the extensions method, map, newsletter, subscriber, endpoints. This project, however, references ASP.NET Core, so framework reference ASP.NET Core to access this endpoint route builder, to be able to extend that. So that's the reason why I made a separate project, one for that, but also, like I just mentioned, in the Blazor server, you might not want this API project. That's why I didn't just create one .backend project to contain all of that and make it more so that you can choose which to use. So let's take a look at those minimal APIs. So you could compare that to the controller, but of course minimal. First thing it does is route builder.map group, and then I added an API route, which just is the name of the newsletter subscribers, which will make it so that you can then do an HTTP call to /newsletter subscribers, and then use that route group to configure the endpoints, so a get endpoint and a post endpoint. The get endpoint gets the newsletter subscribers, which gets this query from the dependency container, and then we can just invoke this handle method on the query class and return the results, the subscribers, and a results.ok result object HTTP result. For the post endpoint, we see as a first parameter the create newsletter subscriber request. This is, you can compare this to the from body. So this is actually going to infer that that is the body, the request body data. And then we access this command, which is registered in our dependency container. and to simply then invoke the handle method on that command, passing down the request data, and return a no content results HTTP result. So now you could extract all of this to a static method. For example, get newsletters subscribers handler or something. I'm just gonna call it like that for now, and then I'd have to define that method here and move that logic there. If this mapping would get too messy, I might do that, but for now I think it's fine like that. There are multiple possible approaches with these minimal APIs. However, I find this one the most reusable one, using that simple dependency injection, which is most familiar if you were programming in a ASP.NET Core project still using those MVC controllers. Then you could simply use the dependency injection to access that controller. Let me show you. This is just a sandbox API project still using those controller classes. Then you could simply inject that get newsletter subscribers query, and then invoke that handle method in the method endpoint. Let me show you another approach. You could make this static class. Static class with that should be probably a static method handle, and then you could replace all of this with that method. I probably need that results.ok. Let's see, could just have it like that. But then this should have for subs equals that, and return results.ok with the subs, and then that return type should be iResults or something like that. And then I would move that code to the features project. But yeah, you see this ASP.NET Core results object, and it would be maybe a bit more awkward to use that in your MVC controller, since that wouldn't follow the dependency injection flow. Also in the Blazor Server project, that might not be really reusable. So I went for the dependency injection approach. Let's undo all of that. Okay. Let me know what you think about that. Did I go too far with also providing these endpoints, or yeah, let me know. And to create such a minimal API project, so I create this brand.api, and that has an example of the minimal API with just the root get method that says hello world. So if I would run this project, I would see hello world. To create such a project without the MVC controllers, you simply do add new project, make sure you have an ASP.NET Core web application, and then choose the empty. That will provide you with the minimal API setup. Note that also doesn't have a Swagger, so I'll add those kind of things later on. The actual reason why I didn't complete the HTTP communication yet is because it doesn't really make sense for me to vertically slice that HTTP client, nor does it make sense to vertically slice a global state provider. So I would probably make a newsletter subscribers HTTP client and then have the get method in there, and the create method, and maybe the put method, and maybe the delete method, which is more of a horizontal slicing approach. Okay, let's now talk about some NuGet packages to leverage. I already showed you the Swagger. That's also possible on a minimal API. I do, however, need some more configuration for that to display properly. And then I'm using Mapster instead of AutoMapper for example, mapping that database data to a response DTO. And Mapster is really easy to use. You don't have to inject it. You can, but you don't have to. You can just, and it has extension methods, this project to type, where you just pass the destination type, and that's all you need to do. That's super simple. If you wanted to map just like this, you could just have source object.adapt to the destination type. Really simple. No configuration as of now, at least. Really simple, really powerful. Talking about mapping data models, classes, and entities, I turned my entities into records, and most of my request response DTOs will also be records because I find those easier to manipulate, to map manually, for example. You could, for example, use such a record to then simply override one of its properties. And this might come in handy later on with complexer nested data. You could ask why make the entities into a record. Well, in previous projects with the web scraping, I had to manipulate those entity classes, and I did not have a good time doing that. So I did it in this project. I have yet to encounter whether that's going to be beneficial or work against me. Of course, this might have some implications with entity tracking, but I don't like those side effects anyway, so then I'd have to configure my data context to turn off that tracking behavior. So then let's talk about the last thing, and that would be MediatR. For this modular setup, if I were to use the horizontal slicing approach, MediatR might not make sense. I might simply just add a services folder and then add the newsletter subscriber service and have that create and get method in there, and then add that as scoped. So you simply use that as injected dependency. But now for this vertical slicing approach, it might make sense to add in MediatR, since what we're doing here is creating command classes and query classes, just to follow the CQRS pattern. But so task-based classes, and then let's say there's 5 or 10 more features in here, would have to make sure we add all of these, register all of these. To make it easier for ourselves, we might want to add a interface, for example, iCommand, and then register all those commands at once using reflection, and the same for the queries, or just all at once. And that's actually where MediatR could help us. I didn't implement it yet because I didn't want to overload you with all kinds of technical decisions, with my technical decisions. So once we used MediatR setup, the project that implements our module is forced to use MediatR. But since I'm more or less already forcing EF Core, Entity Framework Core, and probably in the future, maybe in the future, Identity Framework, and using Mapster, and I'm including the HTTP setup, And the Fluent validation, I might as well add the MediatR. Let me know what you think about forcing that MediatR on the implementation project. Okay, so I covered how I set up that end-to-end solution as a module containing those minimum requirements. I demonstrated how to implement that module into a Blazor Server project, and even in a project where you take the HTTP approach, so an API and a Blazor WebAssembly project. I introduced you to minimal APIs, and I talked briefly about vertical slicing versus horizontal slicing. And I showed you how I approach that project setup. And I talked a bit about extra useful packages like Mapster, how easy it is and powerful, MediatR, how we could use it in this project, and how to set up the Swagger with the minimal APIs, which I'll probably configure a bit more and publish that code base. In upcoming videos, we'll probably implement the other modules while improving our project setup. If this video was interesting or valuable to you, please leave a like and make sure to subscribe to follow the entire video series. See you in the next one.